The bridge of the Kalen smelled like burnt wiring and blood. Commander Mara Voss pressed 2 fingers against the gash above her left eye and watched the display flicker, red, black, red again, before the damage report stabilized long enough for her to read it. 40% hull integrity. Port engine cycling at 12%. Weapons array gone. The whole turret sheared off when the Korathi dreadnought's main battery had raked them across the bow. Long-range communications gone. The antenna mast snapped like a twig and tumbling somewhere behind them in the dark. Half the crew either dead or sealed behind emergency bulkheads in corridors she couldn't reach, corridors that were now open to vacuum. She wiped the blood on her pants and turned to the man slumped in the nav chair behind her. "Ren, hey," she kicked the base of his chair, "you alive or decorative?" Lieutenant Commander Ren Calloway opened one eye. There was carbon scoring on the left side of his jaw where a console had exploded near his face, and his flight suit had melted to his forearm in a way that would need a med-bay surgeon to separate, assuming they ever saw a med-bay again. But he was conscious. That counted. "Decorative implies I'm pleasant to look at," he said, his voice like gravel being dragged over tin. "How bad?" "We're breathing. That's the complete list of good news." He sat up and immediately regretted it, pressing a hand against his ribs where something grated in a way ribs weren't meant to grate. Through the forward viewport, the stars hung motionless. No pursuing ships. No weapons fire. Just the deep empty black stretching out in every direction, cold and indifferent, and the faint amber glow of the Velan nebula off their starboard quarter like the last ember of a dying fire. "The Korathi broke off?" he asked. "The Korathi think we're dead." Mara pulled up the last tactical snapshot before their sensors had gone dark. It showed the Korathi battle group, 7 dreadnoughts, a carrier bristling with fighter bays, and the command vessel Thaxos squatting at the center like a predator over a kill holding position around the jump gate they'd been defending. The Kalen was a speck at the edge of the frame, tumbling away from the engagement zone with no power signature, no heat bloom, nothing to distinguish it from the expanding cloud of wreckage that had been the human Ninth Fleet. We vented atmosphere from decks 3 through 7. Deliberately, from their sensor profile we'd read as debris. "We are debris." Functioning debris, there's a distinction. She almost smiled, almost. The muscles around her mouth remembered how but couldn't quite commit. "Ren, I need you sharp, I need you thinking." 2 hours ago, before everything went sideways, Admiral Chen pushed a priority intercept off the Korathi military net through the fleet channel. An encrypted burst, she barely got it decoded before the Thaxos cut our comms. A research outpost on the 4th moon of Balori Prime, deep inside Korathi-held space. They're developing something there. A biogenetic dispersal agent, something designed specifically to target human DNA, to unravel it, at the cellular level. The silence on the bridge changed quality. It thickened, became a physical thing occupying space. "Not a weapon of war," Mara continued. "An extinction weapon, something you release and then wait. No more humans, anywhere, ever." Ren looked at her for a long time. The emergency lighting turned the blood on his jaw the color of old rust. "And Chen wants us to go get proof," he said. "Not a question." "Chen wants anybody to go get proof. We're the only ship inside the perimeter." She gestured at the viewport, at the vast nothing surrounding them. "Every other vessel in the Ninth Fleet is either destroyed, crippled, or falling back to the Meridian Line. The Kalen is the only human ship within 3 light-years of Balori Prime." "The Kalen can barely hold air, Mara." "I know. We have no weapons." "I know. We have, 19 crew left, maybe 20, half of them are injured." 18, and I know. And Balori Prime is in the absolute heart of Korathi-controlled space. We'd be flying through their living room." "I know that too." She sat down across from him, elbows on her knees, and looked at him the way she always did before she said something he wasn't going to like. It was a specific look, chin slightly down, eyes slightly up, the corners of her mouth pulled tight, and it preceded every terrible decision they'd survived over 8 years of flying together. The Arcturus ambush, the Drift Belt run, the extraction at Kellen Station, where they'd hidden inside the debris ring of a shattered moon for 47 hours while Korathi destroyers hunted them. Some of those decisions had nearly killed them. All of them had brought them here to this moment on this dying bridge. "The mission is recon only," she said. "Get into the outpost, find hard evidence of the bioweapon, data, samples, documentation, transmit it back to command. That's it. That's the whole thing." "You say that's the whole thing like we're picking up groceries." "Ren." He closed his eyes, pressed the heels of his hands against them until he saw colors. When he dropped his hands, the scorched side of his face caught the red emergency lighting and made him look older than 36. Made him look like something the war had chewed up and spit out, which was exactly what he was. "You know," he said, "a sensible officer would point out that this ship has a 40% survival probability just sitting here doing nothing. And attempting a deep space transit to an enemy stronghold in our current condition reduces that number to something a statistician would call functionally fictional. Good thing you've never been a sensible officer." "No." He reached for the nav console and began pulling up star charts with his one good hand, his damaged arm lying in his lap like something that belonged to someone else. "No, I have not." They spent the next hour doing what they'd always done best, making nothing work. Mara crawled through access tubes on her belly, rerouting power from non-essential systems to the single functioning engine, while Ren talked her through junction sequences from the bridge, reading schematics off a cracked datapad held 6 inches from his face, because the main display kept dying mid-refresh. His voice came through the comm channel flat and focused, calling out bus numbers and coupling designations the way a surgeon calls for instruments. "Junction 7 Alpha. Bypass the primary regulator, it's fried. Go straight to the secondary bus. The secondary bus is on the other side of a load-bearing wall, Ren. Then go through the wall." "I can't go through the wall." "Why not?" "Because it's a wall." "Mara, we're in a ship that should be a coffin, flying toward an enemy planet with no weapons and half a crew. The wall is the least of our problems. Find a junction panel and cross-wire it." She found the panel, cross-wired it. Sparks flew, something popped, and a faint hum traveled through the deck plating, the sound of power flowing where it wasn't supposed to flow, coerced and bullied into compliance by human ingenuity and a total disregard for manufacturer specifications. The Kaelin's onboard computer, a mid-grade tactical AI the crew had nicknamed Mother, for reasons no one could remember, though Ren suspected it had something to do with the AI's habit of offering unsolicited advice in a tone that made you feel like you disappointed someone, provided running commentary. "Reactor output at 14%. This is insufficient for sustained faster-than-light travel. Recommended course of action. Transmit distress beacon and await rescue." "Noted and ignored," Mara said from inside a wall panel, her legs sticking out into the corridor. "Commander, I am contractually obligated to inform you that ignoring my recommendations increases statistical mortality by—" "Mother." "Yes, Commander." "Be less helpful." "Acknowledged." "Recalibrating helpfulness parameters." Ren heard it through the open comm channel and something loosened in his chest, not quite a laugh, but the memory of one. He checked the nav solution one more time, ran the numbers again with his one working hand, and committed the course to the computer. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. 8 years. 8 years he'd flown with Mara Voss. 8 years of watching her pull impossible solutions out of impossible situations, of trusting her hands on the controls when every instrument said they were already dead, of sitting in this chair or one like it while she did something reckless and brilliant and came back grinning like she'd gotten away with something. He didn't grin now, Neither did she. They were past grinning, past bravado. What they were running on now was older and quieter, the simple, stubborn refusal to let the universe have the last word. "Course is set," he said into the calm. "Power's rooted," she answered. "Then let's go get ourselves killed." That's the spirit. The transit to the Ballori system took 11 hours. 11 hours of the Kaelin shuddering and groaning through compressed space like an old animal dragging itself across frozen ground, every structural member protesting, every weld and joint singing with the particular high-pitched whine that meant they were one shock away from separation. The ship wasn't designed for this. It was a reconnaissance corvette, built for speed and stealth, and it was being asked to limp through the most dangerous space in the sector on one leg. The surviving crew, 14 souls in various states of damage, did what they could during those hours. Chief Petty Officer Kessler, a broad woman from a heavy world colony with hands like shovel blades and an engineer's instinct for coaxing function from wreckage, led a team of 3 through the lower decks, patching hull breaches with emergency sealant and profanity in roughly equal measure. Lieutenant Park ran continuous diagnostics from the auxiliary station, tracking reactor fluctuations and reporting to Wren in a quiet, steady voice that never wavered even when the numbers warranted screaming. Corporal Diaz, both legs splinted and strapped to a stretcher, insisted on remaining on the bridge to monitor passive sensors, arguing that he could still see and still think, and that was contribution enough. They were all afraid, every one of them. Mara could see it in the way they moved too carefully, too deliberately, the way people move when they're holding themselves together by force of will and suspect that stopping might be fatal. But they worked. They worked because working was better than waiting, and waiting was better than thinking, and thinking about what they were flying toward was the one luxury no one on that ship could afford. Mara slept for 2 of those hours. She didn't mean to. She'd sat down in the captain's chair to review the approach calculations, and her body had simply quit, shutting down mid-thought like a machine reaching its operational limit. She dreamed of rain, not the acid rain of the colony world she'd grown up on, the yellow rain that burned if you didn't get inside fast enough, but real rain, Earth rain. She'd never been to Earth. She'd been born 200 light years from it, on a mining colony where the sky was the color of a bruise, but her grandmother had described it so many times that Mara carried the memory like an inheritance. The smell of it on hot pavement, the way it beaded on window glass, each droplet a tiny lens, the particular gray of a sky about to open up, heavy and soft and full of promise. She woke to Wren shaking her shoulder. His face was grim. "We've got a problem." The problem was a Korathi patrol frigate sitting in a standard orbital sweep around Ballori's 4th moon. It was small by Korathi standards, crew of maybe 30, a single main weapon, light armor, but it was intact, armed, and very much alert. On their current approach vector, the Kaelin would cross its sensor range in approximately 40 minutes. "Can we go around?" Mara asked, already knowing the answer from the way Wren's jaw was set. "Not without another 6 hours of transit time, and the reactor won't hold that long. We're already running on the thermal margin. Mother gives us another 90 minutes of FTL before the core goes critical." She stared at the tactical display. The frigate was making a predictable elliptical orbit, textbook Korathi patrol pattern, the same one taught in their military academies, the same one they'd been using for 50 years. Every 90 minutes, it swung around the far side of the moon, out of line of sight from the surface outpost for approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes to approach, enter atmosphere, find a landing zone, and set down. On a world they'd never been to, in a ship with no shields, no active sensors, and one engine. "That's insane," Wren said. "It's tight." "Mara, tight is parallel parking. This is threading a needle during an earthquake while the needle is on fire, and the earthquake is personal." She was already calculating approach angles, her fingers moving across the nav console, pulling up atmospheric data Mother had scraped from old survey records. If we cut engines at the outer marker and coast on residual momentum, we'll have a minimal thermal signature. The moon has a magnetic field, weak but present. It'll scatter what's left of our heat bloom. We come in cold and fast, hit the upper atmosphere on the dark side, and use the Kalen's drag profile to decelerate. No engine burns, no power spikes. Nothing for their sensors to latch onto. And if we miscalculate the entry angle by even half a degree, we either skip off the atmosphere and tumble into open space with no power to correct, or we come in too steep and burn up. Then we'd better not miscalculate. Ren stared at her. 8 years of this. 8 years of watching her walk up to the edge of what was possible and then lean over it. "All right," he said, "but I'm flying the entry." "Like hell you are. Your arm is fused to your flight suit." "I can fly one-handed." "You can fly one-handed in a simulator. This is a dead-stick atmospheric entry at 7 times terminal velocity into an atmosphere we've never tested with instruments we can't trust." "Mara," his voice was quiet. The tone he used when he wasn't arguing anymore, just telling her something she needed to hear. "You haven't slept more than 2 hours in 30. Your hands are shaking. Don't look at them, they're shaking. I can see it from here. You just missed a decimal point on the nav calculation, and Mother caught it before you did. If you fly this entry and your concentration slips for 1 second, we're dead. You know that." She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. "Fine," she said, "but if you kill us, I'll never speak to you again." "I can live with those terms." The entry was worse than either of them imagined, and they'd imagined it pretty bad. Ren flew with his good hand on the yoke, and his damaged arm cradled against his chest, calling out altitude and velocity readings from instruments that worked half the time, and provided creative fiction the other half. The Kalen screamed through the upper atmosphere of Balori's 4th moon, trailing sparks and fragments of hull plating, the heat shields glowing cherry red, then orange, then white, while the hull temperature climbed past every number that had a safe color associated with it. Mother provided commentary. Hull temperature exceeding design parameters. Structural integrity compromised in sections 2, 5, and 9. Recommend immediate abort. Not helpful, Mother. Acknowledged, Commander Calloway. Continuing to monitor your descent into statistical improbability. Mara braced herself against the co-pilot station and watched the altimeter numbers spin. The viewport was a wall of light, atmospheric friction turning the air around them into a sheath of plasma, and then the light dimmed and they were through, dropping fast, the dark shapes of mountain ranges rising up below them, vast and jagged and entirely unforgiving. Ren aimed for a flat expanse of gray-green terrain between 2 ridgelines. He had no instruments to guide him, no altimeter he trusted, no approach radar. He flew by feel, by the vibration in the yoke, the sound of the air, the pressure in his chest, the way humans had been flying for 1,000 years before they ever left Earth. The landing was controlled in the same way that falling down a staircase is controlled if you happen to land on your feet at the bottom. The Kalen hit the surface, bounced, hit again, slid 400 meters through dense crystalline vegetation that shattered under the hull like a field of glass ornaments, and finally came to rest in a shallow depression between 2 ridges of dark volcanic rock with a sound like a giant exhaling. Silence. The hull ticked and pinged as it cooled. Something deep in the ship's guts made a noise like a large animal settling down to sleep. Dust and crystal fragments drifted past the viewport in the low gravity, catching the distant starlight. Mother, Mara said, "Status." "Landing complete." "I hesitate to call it successful, but we are no longer in motion, which is an improvement. Hull integrity at 26%. Engines offline. Life support functional for approximately 18 hours at current consumption. I would categorize our overall situation as suboptimal with a creative interpretation of the word survivable." Can we take off again? Commander, this ship landed the way a bird lands after being hit by a truck, with sufficient repairs, a favorable atmospheric window, and what I can only describe as divine intervention, perhaps. Ren pulled his hand off the yoke. His fingers had locked around it so tight that he had to pry them loose one by one, and when they finally released, each joint popped like a knuckle being cracked. He looked at Mara. "We're down," he said. "We're down." Neither of them mentioned that getting down had been the easy part. The outpost was 7 kilometers east. They knew this because Mother's passive sensors, the only ones they dared use, anything active would light them up like a flare, picked up the electromagnetic signature of a Korathi power generator, pulsing through the moon's thin atmosphere like a slow, mechanical heartbeat. They went on foot, left the surviving crew with the ship, 14 people in various states of damage, all of them volunteering to come, none of them in condition to make the trek. Mara took the data extraction kit in a pack on her back and a sidearm on her hip, the only personal weapon left on the ship that still held a charge. Ren took a med kit, a cutting tool designed for hull breaches, and an expression that suggested he had strong opinions about the universe and intended to express them. The terrain was alien in the way that unsettled you at a cellular level, beneath conscious thought. The crystalline fungal growth covered everything, the ground, the rocks, even the sparse twisted structures that might have been trees on a world with more sunlight. It grew in branching lattices that rose from the surface like frozen lightning, some of them meters tall, and it caught the dim light of the system's distant star and refracted it into pale rainbows that drifted across the ground like ghosts looking for something they'd lost. Beautiful, utterly silent. The only sound was their boots crunching through the crystal substrate and the faint whistle of wind through the ridges above them. 3 kilometers in, Mara held up a fist, the universal gesture, "Stop, listen." Ren stopped, listened, heard only his own breathing and the wind, and then there, a sound that didn't belong to this place. Thin, high, rhythmic, not mechanical, not geological, not wind. Crying, someone was crying. They found her in a hollow beneath a shelf of volcanic rock, curled in on herself like a pill bug, wrapped in layers of torn fabric that might once have been clothing but was now held together by desperation and habit. She was small, a child, maybe 8 or 9 standard years by human reckoning, though her proportions were slightly off. Limbs a bit too long. Fingers a bit too many, 6 on each hand. Her skin had a grayish cast, like stone dust had been rubbed into it, and her eyes were too large for her face, dark and liquid, and filled with a terror so complete it had become a permanent state of being. She saw them and screamed. It was a small scream, more terror than volume, the scream of something that had learned that the world contained things that hurt and had no reason to believe these two new things would be different. She pressed herself back against the rock face as if she could push through it and disappear. Her enormous eyes locked onto the weapon at Mara's hip, and her 6-fingered hands clutched the fabric around her body, and she made herself as small as she could. Mara did something that violated every protocol in the field operations manual, every rule about contact with unidentified indigenous species, every tactical guideline about maintaining defensive posture in hostile territory. She put the sidearm on the ground, slowly. Then she sat down, cross-legged, and folded her hands in her lap. "Hey," she said, quiet. The voice she used when she talked to the engine room cat back on the Nastron, the old gray tabby that had wandered aboard at a supply depot somewhere in the drift belt and fallen asleep in a ventilation shaft, and by the time anyone found it, the crew had already named it sergeant and given it its own hammock. "Hey, it's okay. We're not going to hurt you." The child stared at her. Ren stood very still behind Mara, barely breathing. He'd seen her do this before, with scared recruits on their first combat deployment, with panicking civilians during evacuations, with a wounded Korathi soldier they'd pulled from a destroyed shuttle who'd been so terrified he'd bitten through his own lip. Mara had a way of making herself unthreatening that went beyond body language. She radiated something: calm, patience, the absolute certainty that everything would be fine, even when she had no evidence to support it. She made the air around her feel safe. Ren had never figured out how. "Do you understand me?" Mara asked. A tiny nod, almost imperceptible. "Good, that's good. What's your name?" The child's mouth worked, opened, closed, opened again, then in a voice like paper tearing, "Vea." "Vea, that's a beautiful name." "I'm Mara, the tall one behind me is Ren. We're humans. We're from very far away, and we're not here to hurt anyone." Another nod, fractionally less terrified. Vea's eyes were still enormous, still fixed on the sidearm lying on the ground between them, but her breathing had slowed from ragged gasps to something that merely suggested panic rather than embodying it. "Vea," Mara said, "are you alone out here?" The child's face crumpled. Not tears, something beyond tears, a grief so large it didn't know how to express itself. And then she said something that made the hair on Mara's arms stand up and the blood in her veins run cold. "They took my mother." The story came out in fragments, like a shattered thing being pieced back together in the wrong order. Vea's people, the Balori, the indigenous species of this moon, the ones who'd evolved here over millennia, who'd built their quiet lives among the crystal forests and the volcanic ridges, had lived here for centuries before the Korathi arrived. When the Korathi established their research outpost, they displaced the remaining Balori population, relocated them, forced them into settlement camps on the far side of the moon where they couldn't interfere with Korathi operations. But some of the Balori had been taken into the facility, not relocated, taken. Vea's mother, Elan, had been one of those. "Taken for what?" Ren asked, and Mara shot him a look that said she already knew the answer and wished she didn't. Vea didn't have a word for it in any language Mara spoke. But the way she gestured at her own arms, at her own body, at the spots where her veins showed blue-gray beneath her stone-dust skin, made it clear enough. She touched the inside of her elbow where something had left marks. Small, precise, clinical marks. The kind made by instruments, not accidents. "Test subjects." Mara felt something shift inside her. It was a familiar shift, one she'd felt before at Kellen Station, at the Drift Belt. Every time the war had shown her something that went beyond tactical considerations into moral ones. The moment where a mission stopped being about orders and objectives and chain of command and became about something older and heavier and more dangerous. Something that didn't have a designation or a protocol number. Something that was just right and wrong, naked and undeniable. The biogenetic weapon they'd been sent to find evidence of wasn't being developed in isolation. It was being developed on living people, on Vea's people, on Vea's mother. She picked up her sidearm, holstered it, and looked at Ren. "Change of plan," she said. "We didn't have a plan. Now we have less of one." She knelt in front of Vea. "Can you show us where they took your mother, where the facility is?" Vea's eyes went wide, not with fear this time, but with something fiercer. Hope, the most dangerous thing in the universe. She nodded. The Korathi research outpost was built into the base of a cliff face, half buried in the rock like a parasite embedded in flesh. It was larger than Mara had expected, a sprawling complex of interconnected modules, landing pads and sensor arrays, all rendered in the Korathi architectural style that favored sharp angles over curves and brutal function over the slightest concession to comfort. The walls were smooth, dark, featureless. No windows, no ornamentation. The Korathi built the way they fought, with absolute efficiency and no interest in beauty. The main entrance was guarded by 2 sentries in full tactical armor, their silhouettes unmistakable even at distance. Tall, 2.5 meters at least, maybe more. Angular. The Korathi were evolved from something predatory on a high-gravity world, something that had hunted in packs across alkaline plains, and 10,000 years of civilization hadn't erased the legacy. They stood the way nothing that had ever been prey would stand. Loose-limbed, utterly still, radiating the kind of patience that belongs to things that have never needed to hurry because nothing they hunted had ever been fast enough to matter. Mara studied them through field glasses from a ridge 500 meters out. Ren crouched beside her, his damaged arm tucked against his chest. Behind them, Vea pressed herself against a crystal formation, making herself invisible with a skill that spoke to months, maybe longer, of terrified practice. "Two at the front," Myra murmured. "Probably another pair at the service entrance north side. Interior complement maybe 40, 60. "The power signature suggests 60 at minimum," Ren said. "Plus research staff, call it 80 total. And we have one sidearm, a cutting tool, and your winning personality." "My winning personality has gotten us out of worse." "Name one time." "Kellen Station." "We almost died at Kellen Station." "Almost" is doing a lot of work in that sentence. She lowered the glasses. The wind was picking up, carrying a faint chemical smell from the outpost, something acidic, antiseptic, wrong. The smell of a place where living things were taken apart to see how they worked, documented with clinical precision, and filed away in databases that would never use the word suffering. "There," Ren pointed toward the eastern edge of the complex. Partially hidden by a rocky outcrop, a waste exhaust port vented thin gray vapor at irregular intervals. Small, maybe a meter in diameter, unremarkable, invisible on a tactical scan. Waste processing. Every Korathi installation uses the same layout. Standard design protocols, it's practically a religion with them. That port connects to the utility network, which connects to the lab levels. That's a theory. That's 6 months of hands-on experience. The Arcturus campaign, remember. I spent half of it crawling through Korathi infrastructure. They build everything the same way. Obsessively. Deviating from standard design isn't just frowned upon in their culture, it's considered a form of intellectual weakness. A failure of discipline. Their architectural philosophy is going to get them infiltrated. Their architectural philosophy already has. They just don't know it yet. They waited for the orbital window. Watched the guards cycle through their patrol pattern with mechanical precision. 4 minutes on station, 2 minutes walking the perimeter, 4 minutes on station. The same timing every cycle without variation. Perfect discipline. Perfect predictability. Mara turned to Vea. "Stay here. Don't move. Don't make a sound. If we don't come back by local dawn, go to our ship. It's in the valley to the west. You'll see the track we left in the crystal growth. When you get there, say the words kitchen garden to the ship's computer. She'll let you in. She'll take care of you." Vea grabbed Mara's hand. Her grip was astonishingly strong for a child her size, 6 fingers wrapping around Mara's wrist like a vine around a branch. "My mother," she said. "If she's in there, we'll find her." "Promise." Mara hesitated. The word hung in the air between them. Ren watched Mara's face and saw the struggle, the truth pulling one way, the kindness pulling the other, and somewhere in between, Mara finding the only thing she could offer that was both. "I promise I'll try," she said. "That's the only honest promise anyone can make, but I'll try with everything I've got." Vea held her gaze for a long time, then she let go. The waste exhaust port was exactly as miserable as advertised. 300 meters of ducting that reeked of chemical waste and biological residue, and something that smelled like burnt copper and old meat. They crawled on their bellies, shoulders scraping the walls, Mara leading and Ren following with his damaged arm held close, and his teeth clenched so tight she could hear them grinding through the calm. Once about halfway through, Ren stopped moving. Just stopped. Mara heard his breathing change, sharp, shallow, the breathing of someone fighting pain. "Ren, give me a second. Take as many as you need." The arm, a long shaking breath. Then, "Okay, moving." They emerged into a utility corridor. Gray walls, gray floor, dim yellow lighting that turned everything the color of old paper. The air tasted metallic and cold, recycled so many times it had been stripped of anything that resembled freshness. Antiseptic and machine oil, and that underlying chemical wrongness that clung to the back of the throat. Ren oriented himself with the datapad, cross-referencing the corridor layout with the standard Korathi schematics he'd memorized during the Arcturus campaign. Labs are 2 levels down. Central cluster, maximum security wing. Security we can't bypass. Security designed to keep things in, not people out. Think about it, the Korathi don't plan for this. They don't plan for 2 humans crawling through their sewage system with a pistol and a bad attitude. Their security doctrine is built around fleet-scale threats, orbital bombardment, armored assault. The concept of infiltration by individual personnel isn't absent from their tactical thinking. It's simply not present. It doesn't occur to them because nothing in their evolutionary history or military experience has prepared them for the idea that a creature would willingly make itself small and vulnerable to achieve an objective. Because it's stupid. Because it's human, he grinned. It was the grin that had gotten him reprimanded 16 times and promoted 3 times, the grin that appeared on his face when he was terrified and committed, and a little bit in love with the sheer absurdity of what they were doing. The Korathi fight wars the way they build buildings. Standard patterns, optimal force distribution, predictable escalation. They've never fought anything like us because nothing else fights like us. What do we fight like? Cornered animals with engineering degrees. They move through the facility like ghosts in a cathedral. The Korathi operated on a rigid schedule, work shifts, rest shifts, maintenance shifts, each transition marked by a tonal chime that resonated through the walls at precise intervals, and the corridors between modules fell empty during these transitions. Mara counted the rhythm. 12 seconds of chime, 40 seconds of movement as personnel relocated, then stillness, a window of perhaps 3 minutes before the next corridor became active. They used every second, crossing open ground in quick bursts, ducking into alcoves and storage bays when they heard the heavy measured footsteps of Korathi personnel approaching. The floors were polished dark stone, not metal, stone, quarried and fitted with a precision that spoke to either advanced machining or obsessive craftsmanship. Their boots made almost no sound on it, which was fortunate, because the acoustics in the corridors were designed to carry. Every sound traveled. Every whisper became a conversation. The Korathi had built their facility to be transparent to itself. No blind spots, no dead zones, no secrets between the walls. It was a space designed by a species that trusted absolute visibility over concealment, which made it deeply ironic that 2 humans were crawling through it unseen. Once, a Korathi officer stopped so close to Mara's hiding spot, a recessed equipment niche behind an atmospheric processor, that she could see the texture of his skin. Not scales exactly, but dense overlapping plates, like the belly of a crocodile rendered in dark blue-gray, with a faint iridescence that caught the yellow lighting. His eyes were forward-facing, predator's eyes, set deep in a skull built for impact, and they swept the corridor with the casual alertness of an apex predator in its own territory. He was checking a datapad, making a note, going about his work with the unhurried confidence of someone who existed at the top of every food chain he'd ever encountered. He didn't look down, he didn't check the alcoves, he didn't search the shadows. They never did. It wasn't arrogance, it was something deeper, a fundamental inability to imagine that a threat could come from below, from something small, from something that shouldn't have been there. The lab level was worse than anything Mara had prepared herself for, and she had prepared herself for something terrible. The rooms were arranged in a ring around a central processing unit, a massive cylindrical structure that hummed with power, its surface crawling with bioluminescent conduits that pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves like a mechanical organ. Each room contained rows of transparent containment pods, smooth, ovoid, filled with a pale blue-green suspension fluid. Inside the pods were Balori, dozens of them. Men, women, children. Some were unconscious, their bodies floating in the suspension with an almost peaceful stillness. Some were awake, their eyes open and unfocused, their mouths slightly parted, their bodies connected to clusters of tubes and monitoring equipment that pulsed with Korathi biotechnology. Mara stood in the observation corridor above the main lab and felt her hands go cold. Not metaphorically cold, physically cold, as if the blood had retreated from her extremities, gathering around her heart in a kind of biological recoil. Ren stood beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The hum of the processing unit filled the silence between them, a low, steady pulse that sounded almost organic, almost like breathing, as if the machine itself were alive and patient and hungry. In the nearest pod, a Balori woman floated with her arms drifting at her sides. Her eyes were closed. Her face was slack. But her fingers, all 6 of them, were curled slightly inward, the way a sleeping person's hands curl when they're dreaming of holding something. Or someone. "The bioweapon," Ren said finally, and his voice was stripped of everything except the words themselves. "They're building it from them." Her voice was flat, controlled, the voice she used when the alternative was screaming or breaking something. "They're using the Balori as a genetic template. Their DNA must share some structural compatibility with ours, enough to engineer a targeted dispersal agent. Enough to build something that looks like a Balori-specific pathogen, but attacks human genetic code." She was already pulling out the data extraction kit, her hands moving with automatic precision. Plugged it into a Korathi data terminal, began pulling files, research logs, genetic sequences, weapon specifications, test results, environmental stability data, dispersal models, page after page of clinical documentation describing, in the dry, precise language of Korathi science, how they were methodically dismantling an entire species to build something capable of dismantling another. "Mara," Ren's voice was careful, "there are living people in those pods." "I know. We can't just—" "I know," she looked at him. Her eyes were bright and hard and burning with something that had no name in military vocabulary. "But if we try to free them now, with one sidearm and no extraction plan, in a facility with 80 hostile personnel, we'll all die. Them included. The mission is the evidence. We transmit this to Command. Command brings the fleet, and the fleet liberates this facility with enough firepower to make the Korathi wish they'd never heard of this moon. That's how we save them. Not by getting killed trying to be heroes." He nodded. He hated it. She could see it in his face, the same thing she felt, the same sick wrongness of leaving living people in glass coffins while you walked away with a data chip. But he nodded because she was right and they both knew it. And sometimes the right thing and the easy thing and the good thing were 3 different things entirely. The download bar crept forward, 60%, 70%. At 80%, Mara found the file. It was buried in the research logs, flagged with a priority marker her translator rendered as subject of note. She opened it, and the world tilted. Subject 7 Vea, juvenile female, approximately 8 standard years, offspring of Subject 2 Elan, escaped containment during interfacility transfer, current status, unrecovered. Subject displays anomalous resistance to dispersal agent variants 4 through 7. Genetic analysis indicates potential key to human-targeted calibration. Recovery priority, maximum. They hadn't just taken Vea's mother. They'd had Vea too. She'd been in one of these pods, connected to these tubes. A child used as raw material. And she'd escaped somehow, impossibly. She'd gotten free during a transfer and disappeared into the crystal forests, and they'd been hunting her ever since. Because her blood was the key. Her genetic anomaly was what they needed to make the weapon work against humans. Mara thought about the child on the ridge. wrapped in torn fabric, trusting two strangers, waiting. 90%, 95. Then the alarm hit. The sound was inhuman, a rising oscillation that came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, vibrating at a frequency that made Mara's teeth ache and her vision blur. Red light flooded every surface. Heavy boots hammered on metal, getting closer. Korathi voices, sharp, clicking commands in their staccato language, words that meant find them, seal the exits, weapons free. "We're made," Ren said, already moving toward the corridor. 97%. Mara. 3 more seconds. We don't have 3 seconds. Then give me 2. 98, 99. A Korathi soldier came around the corner at a dead run. Ren hit him with the cutting tool, not elegantly, not skillfully. He swung it two-handed the way a man swings an axe when there's no time to think about form, and the Korathi went down, armor cracking, and Ren grabbed the alien's pulse rifle before the body finished falling. The weapon was heavy, built for hands larger than his, but he braced it against his hip and it hummed to life. 100%. Done. Mara ripped the extraction kit free. Go now. They ran. What followed was not a battle. Battles imply two sides with strategies. What followed was two wounded, exhausted, bleeding humans sprinting through an alien facility with stolen data and a borrowed weapon, pursued by 60 Korathi soldiers who had just discovered that their most classified research installation had been infiltrated by the species they were trying to eradicate. Ren fired the pulse rifle one-handed, laying down suppressive bursts at intersections while Mara navigated from memory, retracing their route through the utility corridors. The Korathi responded the way they always responded, with overwhelming coordinated force, tactical formations, standard engagement protocols. They moved in disciplined groups, covering angles, maintaining spacing, communicating in clipped precise bursts. Mara and Ren didn't do any of that. They ran like humans run when the situation is beyond saving, ugly, desperate, adaptive. When a corridor was blocked, they went through a maintenance hatch. When a hatch was sealed, Ren shot the control panel. When they reached a junction and couldn't remember which way they'd come, Mara chose left because something in her gut said left, and it was wrong. So they doubled back under fire and went right while pulse blasts scorched the walls centimeters from their heads, and the air filled with the hot metal smell of vaporized bulkhead. They reached the waste exhaust duct. Mara went in first, hauling herself forward on her elbows, and Ren came after, firing one last burst down the corridor before squeezing his shoulders into the opening. Behind them, the Korathi facility commander, a tall figure with ceremonial scarring etched into his jaw plates, a mark of strategic rank, reached the duct and stopped. He could see them inside, could hear them crawling. His weapon was raised. The shot was clear. He lowered the weapon. The duct was too small, 1 meter in diameter. His soldiers were 2.5 meters tall. Not one of them could fit. The humans had escaped through infrastructure the Korathi had built and never considered as a vulnerability because it was too small for any Korathi to enter. The expression on the commander's face, visible even through the alien geometry of his features, was not anger. Anger he would have understood. What he felt was older and stranger. Confusion. The profound, destabilizing confusion of a predator discovering that the prey had rules it didn't know existed. They burst from the exhaust port into cold air and thin starlight, gasping, bleeding, hands scraped raw from the ducting, lungs burning from the chemical residue they'd been breathing for the past 10 minutes. The crystal landscape spread before them in every direction, pale and shimmering under the distant sun, beautiful in a way that felt like an insult after what they'd just seen underground. Mara sprinted to the ridge where Vea waited. The child hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound, had sat in the exact position they'd left her and watched the alarms and the red light bleeding from the outpost's ventilation ports with her enormous dark eyes and stayed. Stayed because she'd been told to. Stayed because she'd trusted. "Are you hurt?" Vea asked. She was looking at the blood on Mara's face, at the new tears in Ren's flight suit, at the way they both moved like people who were running on something deeper than physical capacity. "We're fine," Mara said. "We got what we came for, and we know your mother is alive. We saw the records." Vea's face did something that Mara would remember for the rest of her life. It opened. The fear and the guardedness and the months of survival mode hardness cracked apart for just a moment, and underneath was a child. Just a child. And the child was hoping. "Time," Mara said, pulling her voice back to operational. 8 minutes to orbital window," Ren answered. 7 kilometers to the ship, 8 minutes. Behind them, the outpost was fully awake now. Landing pad floodlights blazed to life, throwing hard white light across the volcanic rock. The low rumble of atmospheric interceptors spinning up on their launch rails carried through the thin air, a sound like distant thunder that wasn't distant enough. They would send air pursuit. They would send ground teams. The 12-minute gap in the frigate's orbital pass was shrinking with every second. 7 kilometers to the ship, 8 minutes to window, 2 wounded adults and a child. "We won't make it at this pace," Ren said between ragged breaths. "We'll make it." Mara, mathematics. Mathematics doesn't know us. They ran. Mara carried Vea after the first kilometer when the child's legs gave out, hoisting her onto her back the way her grandmother had carried her through the yellow rain on colony days when the acid came down too fast. She didn't slow down. Her body had moved past exhaustion into that strange country beyond it, the place where muscles function on memory and stubbornness, and something that isn't quite adrenaline anymore but refuses to be surrender. They moved through the crystal forest, staying in the densest growth. The lattice formations rose around them, scattering their heat signatures, diffracting their electromagnetic profiles into 1,000 phantom readings. The landscape itself was hiding them, an alien ecology unknowingly sheltering the species that had come to save a piece of it. Ren walked beside her, the alien rifle slung across his back, his damaged arm swinging uselessly. Somewhere in the 4th kilometer, without realizing it, he started humming. A fragment of something, not quite a melody, more like the ghost of a song, an old thing. A lullaby his grandmother had sung on the colony ship when he was small, when the void outside the hull felt too large, and the dark between stars felt too deep, and a child needed to hear a human voice making human sounds to remember that the universe, for all its indifference, contained things that were warm. Mara glanced at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing, keep going." He did, and the child on Mara's back, who'd been rigid with fear, slowly softened. Her grip on Mara's shoulders eased, her breathing slowed. Her head dropped against Mara's neck, and by the time they reached the Kaolin, Vea was asleep. The Kaolin was where they'd left it, half buried in shattered crystal, its hull dented and scorched and cracked and beautiful the way only broken things that still function can be beautiful. "Mother," Mara said as she carried Vea up the ramp, "we're back. We have a child. She needs medical attention." "Welcome back, Commander. Medical Bay is prepared. I note that your own biosigns suggest you could also benefit from medical attention." "Later." "Of course, later as always." "Prep for emergency launch." "Commander, I feel it necessary to observe that emergency launch implies a level of capability this vessel does not currently possess. However, Chief Kessler and the remaining crew have made repairs during your absence. The main engine is at 22%, an improvement of 8%, achieved through methods that void every warranty this ship ever had." "Can we fly?" "I can get you off the ground. I can get you through the atmosphere. Whether I can get you to the jump point before the Korathi frigate turns its attention to us is a question I prefer to answer with optimism rather than mathematics." Ren was already in the pilot's chair. The instruments flickered to life. The engine caught rough, uneven, a sound like a diesel motor in winter, but it caught. 4 minutes to orbital window, he said. If we're going now. Mara laid Vea on the medbay cot. The child stirred. Her dark eyes opened and found Mara's face and held it. My mother, she whispered. Mara took her hand, 6 small fingers wrapped around hers. The data we stole, when our people see it, when they see what's being done here, they'll come back. With everything, every ship, every soldier, and they will get your mother out. I promise. You said you could only promise to try. I'm upgrading the promise. A ghost of a smile crossed Vea's face, the first smile Mara had seen from her. Mara went to the bridge, strapped in, looked at Ren. He looked at her. 8 years of unspoken language passed between them in a single glance. He lifted the Kaelin off the surface of Balori's 4th moon with one hand and a prayer, and the ship rose, shuddering, groaning, shedding crystal fragments and hull plating, through the atmosphere, through the alien twilight, through the last fingers of gravity and into the open black. The frigate appeared on passive sensors 30 seconds after they cleared the thermosphere, already turning, weapons charging, hailing them on the standard Korathi surrender frequency. They want us to stop, Mother reported. We're not stopping. They seem quite insistent. Ren, time to jump point. 3 minutes. They'll be in weapons range in 90 seconds. The first shot crossed their bow, close enough to light up the hull with reflected energy, close enough to rattle the bulkheads. A warning. Korathi military protocol, 1 warning shot followed by destruction, civilized, formal, predictable. Ren didn't dodge. Couldn't. The ship would come apart if he tried evasive maneuvers. Instead, he did something that violated every principle of spaceflight and combat and basic self-preservation that had ever been written down. He flew straight at the frigate. Ren, Mara said. I know. Ren, what are you? Trust me. The frigate's weapons officer watched the crippled human vessel accelerate toward him. A ship with no shields, no weapons, 26% hull integrity, flying directly into his engagement envelope. It was the easiest target he had ever been presented with. He charged the main battery. His commander authorized lethal force. And at the last possible moment, at the instant when the firing solution was locked and the trigger pull was measured in milliseconds, Ren hauled the yoke back with everything the Kaelin's 1 functioning thruster could give. The ship pulled up. The hull screamed. Panels buckled. Mother announced structural failures in a voice that had finally lost its composure. But the Kaelin held. It held because somewhere in a shipyard years ago, a human engineer had looked at the stress tolerances and thought, what if it needs to do more than it's supposed to, and added an extra weld. Because a technician had reinforced a strut that technically met spec but didn't feel right. Because humans built things the way they lived, with margins for the impossible, with allowances for the act of desperation that the blueprints never accounted for. The frigate's main battery discharged into empty space, and the Kaelin, riding its insane momentum, screamed past the frigate's hull close enough to see the individual sensor pods, through the weapons arc, past the engagement envelope, and into clear space. Jump point in 30 seconds. They're coming about. Standard Korathi turn takes 45 seconds. They won't make it. You bet our lives on that. I bet our lives on the fact that they can't imagine doing what we just did, so they didn't build a protocol for responding to it. The stars stretched, the moon shrank to a point. Space folded and the Kaelin leapt through it, and Balori disappeared. In the medical bay, Vea slept through all of it. Admiral Chen received the transmission 4 hours later. She stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Resolute and watched the files unpack across her display. Research logs, genetic sequences, weapon specifications, environmental models, dispersal projections. And then she opened the final attachment. A photograph, taken by Commander Mara Voss on her personal datapad. Rows of containment pods stretching into the distance under cold blue light. Living beings floating in suspension fluid, tubes in their arms, monitors tracking their slow dismantlement. And in the corner of the frame, half visible, a pod labeled in Korathi script that the translator rendered with terrible clarity. Subject to Elan. BALORI female. Ongoing. Chen closed the file, stood still for 30 seconds, the longest 30 seconds anyone on that bridge had ever witnessed. Her face was stone. Her hands, clasped behind her back, trembled once and then went still with the conscious effort of a woman forcing herself to think before she acted, to be strategic when every nerve in her body wanted to be furious. Then she opened a fleet-wide channel. Her voice, when she spoke, carried no emotion. That was how her crew knew it was bad. Chen got quieter as things got worse. All ships Balori Prime, full force. The channel erupted. Questions, confirmations, coordinates being exchanged. But underneath it all, underneath the professional chatter of a military machine spinning up to its maximum capacity, there was something else. A frequency that couldn't be transmitted through any antenna or decoded by any receiver. The sound of human beings who had seen what was in that photograph and decided collectively, simultaneously, without discussion, that there were some things that could not be allowed to stand. The response was the largest combined military action in human history. 47 warships, 3 carrier groups. Every available vessel from the 9th, 12th, and 15th fleets, pulled from patrol routes and garrison duties and defensive positions. Every captain who received the file making the same decision Chen had made. This stops now. They didn't come for strategy. They didn't come for territory or resources or political advantage. They came because they'd seen the photograph, and the photograph had done what photographs do. It had made the abstract concrete, the distant personal, the tolerable unforgivable. The Korathi facility commander, the one with the scarring on his jaw plates, filed his after-action report 3 days later. It would become the most widely cited military document in Korathi history, not for its tactical analysis, which was thorough, not for its strategic recommendations, which were sound, but for a single paragraph near the end, written in the spare formal prose of a soldier who has encountered something he cannot explain within his existing framework. The humans do not conform to recognized threat models. When damaged, they do not withdraw. When outnumbered, they do not calculate optimal surrender conditions. When cornered, when every metric available indicates that continued resistance is irrational, they do not behave irrationally. They behave according to a logic we have not identified. They become more dangerous in proportion to their desperation. This is not courage as we understand it. This is something else. I recommend that all Korathi tactical doctrine be revised to account for the following principle. A wounded human is not a weakened adversary. A wounded human is an adversary who has stopped calculating and started improvising. And a human who is improvising is the most dangerous thing in the known galaxy. The Intergalactic Federation, when it was chartered 31 years later, adopted many rules. Rules about sovereignty and trade, and the use of force and the treatment of prisoners, and 100 other accommodations necessary for species who'd spent generations trying to destroy each other to coexist in something resembling peace. But there was one rule that every member species accepted without debate, one rule proposed by the Korathi themselves. One rule carved into the Federation Charter in every language of every member world, displayed in every embassy, taught in every military academy, understood by every diplomat and soldier and trader and child who had ever wondered what made humans different. Never corner a wounded human. Because a wounded human doesn't weigh odds. A wounded human doesn't follow doctrine. A wounded human reaches into the wreckage and the fire and the impossible dark and pulls out something that has no right to exist. A solution built from stubbornness and spit, and the absolute refusal to let the story end here. The Kaolin was decommissioned after the war, too damaged to repair, too old to refit, too small to matter in a fleet that had grown tenfold. By every rational measure, it should have been scrapped. They put it in a museum instead. On the bridge, preserved behind glass, they left a cracked datapad with a star chart still displayed, and a cutting tool with Korathi blood on its blade. Beside them, a plaque, Commander MARAVOSS and LT. Commander RENNCALLOWAY, who flew broken and came home. Vea visited every year for the rest of her life. She would stand on the observation deck and look at the ship that had carried her through the dark, and she would remember the woman who had put her weapon on the ground and sat in the dirt and spoken to a terrified child in a voice like rain on pavement, like the rain her grandmother once described, the rain on a world she'd never seen, warm and clean, and full of the quiet promise that some things in the universe were still gentle. Her mother Elan stood beside her, freed in the liberation of the Balori outpost, alive, scarred, but alive. Some promises, it turned out, were worth everything it cost to keep them. Even the ones you weren't sure you could make. Especially those